We're coming up August the 22nd, 1964, in my opinion, one of the most significant and courageous days in the history of African people here in the United States. It's the day that Mama Fannie Lou Townsend Hamer gave some riveting, uh, extraordinarily powerful testimony and indictment of American apartheid before the Credentials Committee of the 1964 Democratic National Convention, which took place in Atlantic City, New Jersey. I call it the Fannie Lou Hamer MFDP convention because they really dominated the events despite the way things came out. And so we wanted to show this testimony that Mama Hamer gave on August 22nd, 1964. But first, just a little background for people who perhaps may not know, which everyone should know, who this esteemed ancestor, Fannie Lou Townsend Hamer, was and is. She was born October 6, 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi, the youngest of 20 children, born to sharecroppers Jim and Ella Townsend. She said when she was 6 years old, she joined her family in the fields picking cotton and dropped out of school by the time she was in the third grade. Now, when you hear this sister speak, you will say third grade. My God, it's really incredible. She worked picking cotton for a tenant farm owner W.D. Marlowe from 1944 until 1962. She caught polio, which made it very difficult for her to work in the fields. She married a strong Black man by the name of Perry, nicknamed Pap Hamer, in 1945. In 1961, they always wanted to have children, and she had for years been trying to have children. And she found out that what happened is that she was one of the numerous Black women who was sterilized by the white supremacy dynamic so that they couldn't have children. Just a form of genocide, if you want to be perfectly honest. She says, one fateful day while walking by the Ruleville, Mississippi town center, that's where she moved to Ruleville in Sunflower County, Mississippi, in the Delta. She saw a sign posted by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and decided to investigate. She joined SNCC and worked as a field worker on a voter registration committee. The committee worked on preparing Black people to read and write so that they could register to vote. 17 people tried to register and were turned back one day. And she's going to talk about this in the testimony. I'm just giving some background. When Marlowe, the farm or the plantation she worked on, was informed of the drive to register, he threatened Fannie Lou and her Hamer and Fannie Lou and her family with expulsion from the plantation. She left that night and stayed with friends, but it wasn't long before her location was discovered, and she and her friends were shot at by night by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So basically, Fannie Lou, by this time, was recognized. First of all, she picked as many pounds of cotton as any man in the fields. She was recognized as a leader, a singer, in her church, singing the gospels. And she was already recognized as a leader. So the local raw elements of the white supremacy dynamic decided that they would try to take her out. So she had to move from house to house different nights, and the night riders of the KKK would ride by shooting in houses. On the night of September 10th, 1962, the night riders raided the Black community looking for Miss Hamer. Armed with shotguns, the drive-by shooters fired into several homes. They missed Mrs. Hamer, but two student voting rights activists from Jackson State, 20-year-old Marion Burke, suffered a head wound, and 18-year-old Vivian Hillett was also wounded. Both of them survived. Now, just gives an example of the kind of terror that our people were facing in the 1960s in Mississippi. But they never stopped. They weren't afraid. That's the critical lesson compared to we got all these people running around here now, just deathly afraid of Donald Trump and the Magadon and his minions. I'm so glad our people in the 1960s demonstrated indomitable courage, in the face of terror. Okay. And so these students, these two sisters now, these two Black women students at Jackson State University. We know about the killings at Jackson State in 1970 after the killings at Kent State, the anti-war demonstrations at Kent State. There was civil rights demonstration going on in Jackson at Jackson State, and the police fired into the dorms and fired on at students and killed two young Black men. See, our people faced these terrorists with courage, and now people are running around here scared, just literally scared, And so she's going to talk about a lot of other things that she experienced, the beating in the Winona, Mississippi jail in 1963. So let's listen to the testimony of Mrs. Hamer, and then I'll have some further comments, and Brother Amos will also comment on it.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Rooseville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at the time. After we had taken this test and started back to Rooseville, we was held up by the city police and the state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day with driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued on to Rooseville, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children that told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pop tell you what I said? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I mean that if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. That then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we're not ready for that in Mississippi. And I addressed him and told him, I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself. I had to leave that same night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 6 bullets was fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. That same night, 2 girls were shot in Rooseville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. And June the 9th, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop, was returning back to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailway bus. When we got to Winona, Mississippi, which is Montgomery County, also use the washroom. And 2 of the people to use the restaurant. 2 of the people wanted to use the washroom. The 4 people that had gone in to use the restaurant was ordered out. During this time, I was on the bus. But when I looked through the window and saw they had rushed out, I got off of the bus to see what had happened. And one of the ladies said it was a state highway patrolman and a chief of police ordered us out. I got back on the bus, and one of the persons who had used the washroom got back on the bus too. As soon as I was seated on the bus, I saw when they began to get the people in a highway patrolman's car. I stepped off of the bus to see what was happening, and somebody screamed from the car that the fire workers was in and said, "That's not one there." And when I went to get in the car, when the man told me I was under arrest, he kicked me. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Vesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So, "Well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her, I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman. And he asked me where I was from. And I told him Roosevelt. He said, "We're going to check this." And they left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, "You are from Roosevelt, all right." And he used a curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? We have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Thank you.
Ashe, very, very powerful testimony there. Mrs. Hamer was in Atlantic City as a member of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. This goes to show you the type of consciousness and thinking that we had toward politics at that time, they were barred from being allowed to participate in the voting process by the Democratic Party of apartheid Mississippi. The Democratic Party in the South at that time was the party of American apartheid, as it had been the party of chattel slavery. And so they formed this independent party and decided as a strategy that in order to bring the terrorism and the brutality, the violence, the barbarism of the white supremacy dynamic, both the institutional white supremacy dynamic, under the government of the state government and the local city governments, and the raw elements of the white supremacy dynamic represented by, the people like J.W. Milan, who had, killed Emmett Till, for example. All of these people worked together to deny African people basic rights, despite the fact that, the 15th Amendment had given at least Black men the right to vote. The laws were on the books, but they had the power to rig the system. For example, you may go in to register to vote, and they might have a jar of jelly beans, and they might ask you, how many jelly beans are in the jar. I mean, anything ridiculous. That they would have people reading things that, various literature that the white person administering the test couldn't even read, right? So these are the various types of obstacles they were facing, because in the Delta, as was the case then and as the case now, African Americans were the majority in almost all of these counties that make up what we call the Mississippi Delta. So they were going to put American apartheid on trial and give the whole world, and remember, this is taking place during the Cold War, the whole world, our brothers and sisters, in the Caribbean, on the African continent, this is how African people are being treated in the United States. Okay, so that became a real power struggle at the DNC in 1964. So basically, the Freedom Democrats said that we represent a true democracy, because everybody can vote and everybody can participate. So we should actually be seated to represent Mississippi at the convention. You know that at these the national conventions, you have these state delegations who have participated in the primary voting process, and they're there to basically vote on and nominate, somebody to run for president in their particular party. So that was their challenge. Their challenge was to be seated versus the apartheid Democratic Party of Mississippi. And so that's why Mrs. Hamer was testifying. Mrs. Hamer's testimony was so powerful. She did something on August 22nd, 1964, that no one in history has ever done, as far as my research shows. Maybe someone else knows something different. While Mrs. Hamer was giving her testimony, it was being carried by the networks, the national television networks, which at that time we had the three networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. Somebody grabbed President Lyndon Johnson and said, "You got to get this Black woman off the air. She's going to expose to the whole world how Black people are being treated in the United States." So she forced President Johnson to call the networks and say that he had an emergency press conference that needed to be covered. And so they took Mrs. Hamer off the air in the middle of her testimony. And that might be why the video is like it is. And then so they switched to the White House, and Johnson literally didn't have anything to say. He just got up there and rambled on about some kind of extraneous issues. but it didn't work because later that night, the networks went back and replayed Mrs. Hamer's entire testimony. So what happened is that they sent a bunch of people to negotiate with the Freedom Democrats to see what they would accept. And they had Dr. King and some others, Hubert Humphrey, I think Walter Mondale, some other people, all these people trying to negotiate. And they worked out what they thought was a compromise. They were going to give the Freedom Democrats 2 seats. So y'all can have 2 seats amongst the, you can sit beside the white supremacists, you in the delegation, 2 seats. And to the credit of, Amzie Moore, Annell, Ponder, Victoria, Gray Adams, the native Mississippians, and of course their advisors like our esteemed ancestors, Ella Jo Baker and Bob Moses and others, they said, no, absolutely not. We came to be seated as a delegation. We aren't accepting any 2 seats. No compromise. No compromise. And so, that was the story of, of what happened there. But it just demonstrates power in a lot of ways because of what it forced the white supremacists to do in order to try to make some concessions. And it shows how powerful, communications are, because Johnson had to get Mrs. Hamer off the air. Look, the Russians are looking at this, people in Africa, Malcolm was making the connections during this time. He was talking about, you can't understand what's going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what's going on in the Congo, and you can't understand what's going on in the Congo if you don't understand what's going on in Mississippi. So, this was a powerful moment of independent politics, if only we had continued along that path. One other thing that I want to go back to also, and this is a book for anyone who's interested in the history should read this book. We Are Not Afraid. This is this is an outstanding book that demonstrates the enormous courage and, the obstacles that our people faced during that particular period of time. We are not afraid. Our people were not afraid. Okay. Compared to these people we got running around here today. So one of the things that I wanted to point out was that in addition, to Mrs. Hamer, there were, several other Black women, Annell Ponder, for example. June Johnson was only 15 years old. Okay. Rosemary Freeman, Uvesta Simpson, who Mrs. Hamer mentioned, she was in the cell with Mrs. Hamer, Uvesta Simpson, and then there was a brother named James West. All of these people were beaten. They started with June Johnson, the 15-year-old June Johnson. June Johnson is a legendary activist in the Mississippi Delta. You walk through the Mississippi Delta and you say June Johnson, and the people who are, that live in the area know this history that's been passed down to them. June Johnson is an icon. Most people have never heard of June Johnson. Kwame Ture had a serious crush on this young sister when he got out of Parchman Penitentiary and first met her. So they started by beating her. They started by beating June. This was in 1963, and then they moved there. Annell Ponder and Uvesta Simpson and Rosemary Freeman, and then finally Mrs. Hamer. The objective of the beatings were, we're going to scare these Black folks. These Black women ain't never going to participate in nothing again in their lives. Every one of them continued. And then because their courage was so outstanding, it rallied tens of thousands of Black people in Mississippi to join their cause. This is what you do. Mrs. Hamer, I think she was asked, if I can find this right quick, she was asked, why didn't she leave Mississippi? When asked, why didn't she just leave Mississippi? Mama Hamer replied, why should I leave? I got problems here. I want to change Mississippi. You don't run away from problems, you face them. This is courage. This is courage. Now, I'll let Brother Amos, comment on, on this, and then I'll talk about what happened afterwards by some people who cut deals with the Democrats, and how it kind of led us to the position that we're in today in terms of the neo-colonial politics that infects and affects the African American body politic. Okay, brother.
But interestingly, because we're in an election year, and our people who are on the Democratic plantation, many of them don't realize that it was the Democratic Party who at the time was fighting to stop Black people from having the right to exercise their right to vote, and also, as you mentioned, to also maintain chattel slavery. And it was also many of the Democrats who filibustered and tried to prevent the Civil Rights Act from being passed
Mm-hmm.
in the House and in the Senate by the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some of the things that are never brought up by the people who are married to the Democratic Party, no matter who the candidate is. And when I was listening to this testimony, uh, it makes you think about how the IDF soldiers are treating the Palestinian prisoners. We getting reports of people being raped and sodomized in the prisons. And then when you hear Black people who are telling us to go out and vote, that we can't be worried about what's going on over there. People who have been through, or whose ancestors have been through a struggle, you would think would at least acknowledge the wrong doings of the Israelis over the Palestinians, even the Palestinians who are not members of Hamas, who've been killed or arrested and treated as such.
Mm-hmm.
But as you stated, it is definitely extremely courageous of these sisters, and the brutality that they were able to endure and still be willing to continue to fight. It speaks volumes to not only their character and courage, but it speaks volume to their bloodline. Because I honestly believe that, with us being connected to our ancestors, you are in many cases a representation of your ancestors and your bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
And if you come from ancestors who were cowards, and more than likely you are a coward today and not willing to withstand any type of resistance against your well-being. We know a lot of people today, they'll fold just economically. So we're talking about people who in these times who are already living in poor economic conditions, who are willing to fight. Today, you take away somebody's house or their car or their job, and they're done. So coming up on this, as we'll post this tomorrow, which will be August 22nd, 60 years. Now we have to ask ourselves, as we are aligning with the Democratic Party, are we doing the work that our ancestors worked for? Or are we simply lying down and allowing our alliance to the Democratic Party to continue to put us in a situation where we're not receiving what we are due in this country? As Amos Wilson stated, Black people didn't get the right to vote by voting. And here you see a prime example of these sisters taking action, not just by saying, we're going to cast a vote, but they took action to get the ability to be able to exercise, for Black people in Mississippi to be able to exercise their rights. And we have to continue to be active in the struggle so that we can get everything else that we're looking for, like reparations and the reform of the justice system and many other things that we're looking for in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. August August 22nd, 1964, August 22nd, 2024, 60 years later, August 22nd will be the day that the Democratic Party nominates the vice president, current vice president Kamala Harris, to be their candidate for the presidency in 2024. And I'm sure that you have people in her campaign that know this history, even though they're not grounded in it. I hope that she doesn't desecrate the good name of Fannie Lou Hamer when she accepts the nomination. But given the fact I haven't watched 1 second of the 2024 DNC, but based on the reports I've read from people like Brother John Jeter and others, it seems to be just a showcase of psychopathic empire personalities who simply want people to ignore the fact that this Democratic Party is part of a political establishment or a power structure that's facilitating genocide in Gaza. We don't have the accurate numbers, but if the truth be told, I'm sure it's 200,000, perhaps 100,000 children, and people will rally around a genocidaire, a person who is facilitating genocide because they are afraid of the opposition. So I hope she doesn't desecrate Mama Hamer's name, but given the fact that, as Mama Marimbani says, hypocrisy is a way of life for these people, most likely that will happen, sadly. And we'll see what happens beyond that. The other thing that I want to say regarding some of the comments that Brother Amos made is that how our this process, this movement where we exhibited so much consciousness, moral conscience, and courage, what happened to that process? And this is something I wrote on my blog, which I don't keep up to date anymore, but it's still there for history, which I call a critical error. Critical error. I've always believed that the decision by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to relinquish their independence and join the Democratic Party was one of the most significant lost opportunities of the 20th century for Africans in America. So what happened was, after the party had nominated Lyndon Johnson to be their candidate, Hubert Humphrey for the vice presidency, they found some people in Mississippi who were willing to sell their souls to the devil for a piece of the Democratic Party pie. And so they started going around trying to convince people in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that they had an opportunity to join the white supremacist Democratic Party, but they would be joining the national party of Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey and Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy and whoever else, and not necessarily joining with James Stennis and Eastland and Ross Barnett and all of those institutionalized white supremacists. And unfortunately, a majority of the people who had formed this independent party agreed to abandon the party. Let me continue. Had the MFDP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, remained independent, as Kwame Ture, James Forman, and other MFDP organizers hoped they would, the entire direction of African American politics could have been different and more beneficial to the masses of Africans in America. What we have instead is neocolonialism, that is elected officials tied to the democratic establishment and minimal, if any, economic development for the people they represent. I call it holding office without holding power. Okay, so you see, in places like the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt of Alabama, two critical areas, I would say, without the courage of grassroots Black people in the deep South of this country, the old Confederacy, without these strong Black families who produced these children who were born in the 1940s, like Mama Marimba, Ani and Kwame Ture and Baba Mikasa and Faye Bellamy and Ruby Doris Robinson and all of the others, Cortland Cox, all of the others, Marion Barry, all of the others, who were members, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Cleveland Sellers. Without that foundation in the grassroots of the Deep South, there is no civil rights movement. These were the people who invested the most to bring civil rights about. And when you travel through these areas, you can see, and there's no better example than Selma, Alabama, Dallas County, Alabama. You will see the intense poverty that our people are living in. The people who invested the most benefited the least. But the interesting thing is, the point I wanted to make is, in these counties where you are a Black majority, you don't need the Democratic Party, and you still got to deal with them at the state level, but there are things you can do. Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, formed a farming co-op. Okay, so there are ways that you can still operate independently. We can see what they are doing to Jackson, Mississippi regarding the water, for example, those types of things, but continue along the independent path. Okay, so you don't need the white Democrats to be elected the mayor of Greenwood or Greenville, Mississippi, or Indianola, any of those cities. You don't need it. You don't need them. You could have your own party. Now, granted, like I said, you still got to deal with the state and you got to deal with the feds, but think independently and figure out ways. Our people figured out ways to survive under the harsh conditions of chattel slavery. They figured out how to survive during the overthrow of Reconstruction. Try the independent way. And so what I'm saying is that had the Freedom Democrats remained independent, I believe the course of African-American politics could have been different. As it was, we wound up becoming what Omawale Malcolm X called political chumps, for the Democratic Party. And right now, our people cannot see beyond the parameters of the Democratic plantation, because they have bought into this concept of the lesser evil, and they have this inordinate fear of the greater evil. Who faced more evil than Fannie Lou Hamer and Annell Ponder and June Johnson, Emmett Lewis Till? Look at Marion Burke and Vivian Hillett. Marion Burke shot in the head, 20-year-old student at Jackson State. Do you think the students at Jackson State stopped participating in civil rights? No, they were still participating in civil rights and human rights and anti-war activities in the 1970s when two more students got killed. One a student at Jackson State, another a high school student who was actually just traveling by on his way home and saw the demonstration. Okay? But this fear, we're so scared. I'm just glad our ancestors, and I'm sure, like I'm gonna say, a lot of people are certainly probably descendants of the Archon and other people who fought, I think it's a powerful lesson for us to learn today. But it starts with our youth. It starts with our youth. But somebody has to stand up and say, we're breaking free from this Democratic plantation. We're breaking free. We're breaking free from being, dominated by AIPAC and the military industrial complex and the Wall Street bankers. Right? We're going to try our own way, and let's see who will move with us and try to establish at least some degree of justice. We can't achieve total empowerment as African people until there's global African empowerment, but we can at least start the process. So that's why I think it's so important for us to recognize Mama Hamer and her efforts on August 22nd, 1964. She's certainly one of the greatest models we could emulate, one of the greatest spirits that we could absorb. And certainly this whole process there are a lot of lessons to learn. And we think about what could have been and what still can be.
Well, that's one of the most frustrating things is that they used a lot of the same tactics, and oftentimes we don't learn the lessons. And maybe it's just they're tapping into people's human insecurities or human nature. But oftentimes there's a saying, if you can't beat them, join them. And sometimes with Europeans, for them it goes, if they beat you, have them join you. So we saw this also, in different countries in Africa where African countries were fighting for their independence. Whites would come in and they would use the separation tactic and get they would divide the different organizations up and get, like you said, many members in the organization to join over to an allegiance with them that they can then control, but still have their organization running and functioning as if it was still a grassroots level organization.
Mm-hmm.
So as you mentioned, that a lot of these people who switched over to the Democratic Party and left the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the devastation that it did by turning into politics instead of real politics for Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to learn how to learn from these tactics that they use and stop falling for the bait that so many of our brothers and sisters often do for their own personal gain.
Mm.
But definitely, brothers and sisters, leave your comments down in the comment section. Remember this historic and courageous testimony by our ancestor, Fannie Lou Hamer. And we say, hate, like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, be with Hodier.
Be with Hodier.